hundreds, thousands of planes kept flying every day, 24 hours, to bring in hundreds of thousands of tons of medical equipment, of food and so on for the people in West Berlin. However, it wasn't enough really to prevent, as we know, the city being divided for 50 years. And that's why families were separated, that's why there were so many celebrations. How did those celebrations come about? Why finally did the wall come down? It began with Gorbachev, who in the 1980s came to power as head of the Soviet Union and introduced two words into the political dictionary, really: glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost being an old Russian word for centuries, meaning openness, and perestroika meaning greater participation, restructuring, greater participation by citizens in society. He introduced this. It wasn't easy for Gorbachev because there was a lot of right-wing extremists that didn't want any reforms. They were quite happy, they were doing quite well. He had to fire about 50% of the higher echelons of the civil service in the Soviet Union at the time to push through these changes. Why did he push through the changes? This form of liberalism in the 80s in the Soviet Union was because there was a tremendous amount of corruption. Power and money was concentrated in the apparatchiks, a small group of people that controlled the wealth and the influence. At the time, there was a Star Wars competition, extremely expensive aerial military technological battle between America and Russia. And while America had a lot of money to support its Star Wars program, Russia didn't have too much money. So the economy was literally going into a handbasket, pretty bad situation. But when Gorbachev introduced liberalism and more openness, obviously what happens when you let in a little bit of light into the darkness, people begin to pull another little bit of the hole away and see more light and start investigating more things. And as a result, in the Soviet Union, people began to realize more than ever before of the high rate of alcoholism, of the high mortality rates, people dying at a very young age, at the absolutely horrendous housing, except for these very few people that didn't want these reforms. They learned that in Central Asia, it deliberately was made a desert because they shifted irrigation canals to grow cotton in another part of the country, leaving this literally to just fester into a desert. So the people of the Soviet Union learned so many things because there was more openness, there was more access to information. It had certain effects, of course. One was that in regions of the Soviet Union that, for example, Joseph Stalin had annexed earlier before the war, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, for example, the Baltic countries, they pushed for independence. And in the elections that occurred in the 80s, leaders from those regions that were pro-independent won the elections. The same thing happened in Georgia and in Ukraine, for example. So this liberalism, this greater freedom of movement, this greater freedom of information spread across the whole Soviet Union. And it also had an effect in the satellite countries, such as Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Romania. Reagan visited Berlin and he spoke to Gorbachev and he said the Berlin Wall must come down, it's time. In 1980, so this was building up and getting larger, this movement for greater openness and freedom. And in 1989, of course, was a pivotal year. Because in 1989, with the help of the then Archbishop of Warsaw, who became the Pope, the first ever free trade union was formed in Poland. In Hungary, the border barriers at the border, they fell with Austria, greater openness. And 13,000 East Germans who had been on holiday in Hungary were able to move into Austria and ask for refugee status, which they would never have been able to do before. So the bubble was getting bigger. It was just a matter of time before literally the communist bubble burst. And I was reading an interview with Jaruzelski, who was then the communist dictator of Poland. And he said that in many ways Poland was Gorbachev's freedom laboratory, because a lot of this openness had first started there, encouraged tacitly by Gorbachev, because he could have stopped it if he wished. And he didn't. And he said that he and Gorbachev and the then communist dictator of East Germany, a fellow called Honecker, were sitting in a grandstand in a big stadium, and East Germany was celebrating the 40th anniversary of the setting up of the country. And but as people marched in front of these three famous leaders, some of the people looked up and shouted, "Gorby," because they called him Gorby for short. "Gorby, help us! Gorby, freedom! Gorby, freedom!" They started chanting, which we'd unheard of before. They would have been arrested and imprisoned for years. And Jaruzelski, the Polish dictator, said he went over to Gorbachev once the parades had passed, and he said, "This is the end, isn't it?" And Gorbachev said, "Yes, it is." Within a very short time, I mean weeks, not even months, Honecker was out. In October, he was gone. And a new era came to East Germany. A new president was imposed, a new government was brought in. And on November 8th, there was an interesting bit of confusion, because on January 8th, reporters were all told by the propaganda minister in a press conference. They were talking about a range of generic issues, not very interesting, but everyone wanted to know, is communism over? And an Italian journalist in the audience, just like one of you, asked, "When will the Berlin Wall come down?" And to everyone's shock and amazement, he said, "Today. People can cross over." And there was a silence in the room. People were stunned. They thought, because it was through a translator, they thought maybe the translation wasn't quite right. Mm-hmm. But everyone ran to their phones to call their newspapers, to call the news centres of their television stations. But the propaganda minister was actually wrong, because when word got out and people rushed to the wall, the soldiers were there, and the soldier said, basically, "No way. We haven't been told you can cross over here." It happened the next day, November 9th, when people came across the wall. So while there was a little bit of confusion, it happened within 18 hours of his announcement that particular day. As I say, the first week I remember was just utter confusion. No one knew what was happening. No one knew who was in charge. No one knew what the future was going to be. Everyone was just absolutely ecstatic. The only word that you could hear was freedom. Freedom. We are free. There was huge lines of cars. Huge queues of cars. People abandoned their cars. They started walking just to get across the wall. Why? Because they were afraid that maybe someone had got it wrong.